So now we're going to talk about music and the Middle Ages, and also how the Middle Ages began to shift away from the stagnant nature of the artwork, and as we began to build towards the Renaissance, which again start in the year 1400. Oh, this is part 2 of the audio lecture on the Middle Ages. Around the year 800, King Charlemagne in France began a period of renewed interest in classical learning. This sowed the seeds for the Renaissance 600 years later. After the turn of the millennium in the year 1000, many people thought the world was going to end. It was a lot like in Y2K, if some of you remember that. Everyone thought this terrible calamity was going to happen in the year 1000. And when it didn't happen, there was sort of a period of celebration, and it involved revived economic, social, and cultural growth. This was also a period of massive pilgrimages. Everybody took a pilgrimage. Everybody, that was something that people wanted to do in their life. When the faithful would undertake long journeys to visit holy sites in order to strengthen and to express their faith. Now, this was a great business thing, too, because these pilgrims spent money and they gave alms to the churches. Above is a model on the right of the monastery at Cluny in France, and it was originally built to house 1,200 monks and 80 royalty. It was designed by a musician named Gunzo, who designed the church to replicate the musical scale. Like many in his day, this monk believed that musical relationships reflected a certain stability of the universe, and that the harmony of a musical psalm reflected a greater harmony, which he called the music of the spheres. And so he built this monastery based on, or to reflect, the music of the spheres. Now, this was later destroyed by fire, but I find it a really wonderful concept to think about this relationship between music and architecture. I'm not quite sure how it worked, but I bet there was a lot of harmony in this place. Here's a musical scale of the time and a plan of the monastery at Cluny. If you think about Gregorian chants, the way you think of medieval monks in these complex harmonies singing the psalms, that's what we're talking about here, as they would say that reflected what they called the music of the spheres. Kind of cool, huh? All right, let's talk about Gothic architecture, which is what a lot of us think about when we think of the Middle Ages. Think of a Gothic cathedral. Beginning around the year 1100, a style of building developed in which massive cathedrals were built with the emphasis on the upward thrust and light. One of the primary visionaries of this style was a man known as Abbot Suger. He believed that there was a symbolic transformational power in light, which he called lux nova. That means new light. He also believed in expressing the glory of God with gold and with jewels. In other words, God has chosen us to be his royal people, so God would want us to have a lot of gold and jewels. Now, when we get to St. Francis, this concept that the priests were supposed to be rich and lavishly treated, that is challenged by St. Francis. But we're not there yet. Abbot Suger, he was all for it. And if you look at his chalice above, you can see it's gold, sacred stones, beautiful glass. And it was in this spirit that many of these great cathedrals were built. Suger wanted the Christian person to experience a flood of divine light upon entering the church. And to do this, he used stained glass windows that helped to create this gem-like effect. Multicolored, I mean, it must have been so spectacular to the first worshipers to experience the Gothic cathedrals. He wrote that he wanted the whole church to shine with uninterrupted light of the most sacred windows, pervading the interior with beauty. His ideas for sacred buildings also helped to elevate the status of France in Europe, and it encouraged a great building boom in which each architect endeavored to make his cathedral soar higher and higher. Now, of course, a lot of them fell over, and we have a film this week that talks about that. Here's a little bit of a look at how they did it. And this is also going to be in our movie this week. The two interior examples show the technique called ribbed arches and groin vaults. Hey, if somebody were to ask you, how did the architects of the Middle Ages achieve their cathedrals? You could say ribbed arches and groin vaults. Can you hear that there's a cicada in the room with me? There is. So anyway, back to this. They also had something called flying buttresses. And a flying buttress is a really incredible concept. Let's look at this image on the right. Okay, so first, before we do that, look on the left. You see there's these soaring walls with a very heavy roof, often made of slate. Okay, so think about the roof is pressing down and these walls are tall and straight. What's going to happen? They're going to blow out to either side. So what these architects did was they made these exterior tower things called flying buttresses, and they would create a counterweight to the weight of the ceiling, and it allowed them to go much higher. And they look kind of cool too. They look like wings on the cathedrals. So let's look a little bit at some of the sculptures from the cathedral at Chartres. Now, thousands of stone sculptures were made at each of these cathedrals. Look at how intricate they are. And when you look at the cathedral, many of these are like tens of hundreds of feet high, so you can't even really see them. But there would be these armies of artisans, big groups of artisans that would join together, work anonymously in shops, and create these cathedrals. Spectacular time of developing art. But now we're going to ease on out of the Middle Ages and move our attention to the Renaissance. Around the year 1300, changes began to occur in how figures were portrayed in art. Look at these two examples above. On the right, we have a piece by the artist Giotto, and he's really known as the forerunner, or you could call him the grandfather of the Renaissance. So you need to know that. Who is the artist that is really considered to have been the forerunner of that Renaissance? It would be Giotto. Giotto. Make a note of it. Now on the on the left we have Cimabue. And Cimabue, he was a contemporary of Giotto, but notice the difference. First, notice the angels around this figure of Mary on the left. You see they're all pretty uniform, and they all look like they're sort of cut out and placed there. Now, look at the angels on the right. You see how they're taking more human form? Even Mary looks a little bit more believable, as the art is generally moving away from the stagnant figures of the Middle Ages and into something totally different. Now let's talk for a minute about St. Francis, because he was really implemental. He was very important in inspiring the changes that led from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. St. Francis of Assisi lived from 1182 to 1226, and he's often called the prophet of the Renaissance. Now, at the time, the prevailing belief in the Middle Ages was that life on earth was a struggle, and humans had to endure this struggle, and nature was actually something mysterious to be controlled or avoided. Now, think about the Black Plague, about what people did not know about sanitation, about, spoiled food. There's so many reasons that they had to really be afraid of nature. But St. Francis had a different view. He believed that God was expressed through nature, and that the pursuit of a simple, natural life was the best spiritual path. So this humble monk became very popular, and his ideas changed the way that artists looked at the natural world. They began to study the natural world, and their art reflected this. In this painting by Giotto, St. Francis is said to have been preaching a sermon. I love this story. So he's there and he's preaching to all these people who have gathered. But then the birds start just squawking and raising a real ruckus. So St. Francis stops his sermon. He turns to the birds and he says, "Okay, you guys, you just be quiet and let me finish, and then I'll give you your own sermon." So that's what he's doing. He has finished preaching to the people, and now he's preaching to the birds. So this is, again, Giotto. And it might look simple to you at this point, But if you consider that up until this point, the artwork was very stagnant and the forms did not look believable at all, if you consider that, then this is a very revolutionary picture. Now, the shift in style that was started by Giotto would lay dormant for about 100 years after his death. And then this change, this great radical shift in art, burst forth in the time of the Renaissance, where there was a time of great celebration of human potential and of the natural world. So this completes the audio lecture on the Middle Ages. All I can say is thanks for listening.